Welcome to the Circular Economy Show by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where we develop and promote the idea of a circular economy, engage key stakeholders to help make it happen, and mobilise system solutions at scale. My name is Seb. I'm going to be the host of this episode, and alongside me is my colleague Rob.
Hi Seb, looking forward to hosting this episode with you today as we explore the role of finance in the circular economy. We'll be tackling some key questions such as what can investors do to help accelerate the transition to the circular economy, and also what role finance plays in helping emerging markets achieve their circular economy goals.
We have got an exciting lineup of speakers for you today. We're going to be joined by Davinah Milenge, the Circular Economy Programme Officer at the African Development Bank, Audrey Choi, Chief Sustainability Officer at Morgan Stanley, and Paul Bodnar, who is the Head of Sustainable Investing at BlackRock.
To kick us off, let's hear Audrey and Paul in conversation with Judith Evans, the Consumer Industries Correspondent for the Financial Times, as they discuss the opportunities available to investors and banks in the circular economy.
When we think about climate change and climate action, certainly in the past there has been a tendency to see the solution on the supply side. Build more green stuff, right? Whether it's renewable energy capacity or electric vehicles or low carbon cement, the focus of the world to some extent has been on how can we ramp up the production, the financing, the technology to build the assets of the future that can generate the services we want in the modern economy without the emissions that are currently associated with the current asset base. But getting to net zero is so hard that it has forced global industries to transcend this model of sell more stuff, build more stuff, which of course is an attractive proposition, not just for disruptors of these industries, but increasingly for the incumbents. So if you look at steel, for example, the conversation now, which I think is very instructive for circular economy, is not just around how can we usher in the era of green steel, with hydrogen, and how can we manufacture more green steel that the world needs, but a recognition that we also need to focus on recycling of steel and material efficiency. And that actually all three of those basic strategies, greening primary steel production, recycling as much as we can, and reducing the underlying use of steel in new construction and other uses, is important. Now, let's be clear, it has set up big fights in industry because, of course, producers are incentivized to do more. And so the incumbents in the steel industry have a point of view that might be different. And so so on the one hand, I think the lessons are positive, right? In dealing with climate change, which has been such a global focus, the issue of resource efficiency and recycling has definitely come into the fore. On the other hand, I think it has also sometimes made more difficult the work of agreeing on a pathway that an industry is supposed to go down. And if you are a customer of an industry, let's say you're a customer of the steel industry, those customers have now formed sort of an alliance to promote net zero steel buying. It can be confusing whether you're supposed to do this, whether you're supposed to focus on green steel or you're focused on recycling or focus on reuse. So I think when you look at a problem as difficult as climate change or other aspects of sustainable development, achieving consensus about how you transform global industries is hard enough to begin with. And these issues kind of expose fractures in those industries that can have a frictional cost on our ability to solve the problem.
Thank you, Paul. And what role do you think investors such as yourselves can play in this process? And am I right in thinking we're still at an early stage of what's likely to be a really comprehensive transformation?
Yes, I think we are. But the good news is that even in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of funds focused on the circular economy, including those managed by BlackRock. And we definitely see an opportunity to drive capital towards these solutions. I think public equities funds, there might have been one fund in 2018. Now there's over a dozen private market funds as well. And and a large increase in assets under management in such funds. So we've certainly seen very strong interest and very strong returns, to be honest, as these new funds build track records. I think if you're an investor who is focused on long-term value creation, and you live on a planet with finite resources, you have a vested interest in the circular economy. So I think as investors educate themselves about that, they are leaning into this area accordingly.
Thanks so much, Paul. And if we can turn to you, Audrey, and another related global challenge, plastic pollution. You spoke last year, I think, about the circular economy opportunity for investment banks. And I know this has been a focus for Morgan Stanley for a few years now, including with the plastic waste resolution. I'm just wondering, how have your discussions with clients on this topic evolved in the past rather eventful year? And how do you see progress in tackling plastics pollution?
Thanks so much, Judith. It has been actually a very fascinating evolution over the past couple of years. When we launched our plastic waste resolution, actually more than 2 years ago now, and we made a pledge that Morgan Stanley would facilitate the prevention, reduction, or removal of 50 million tons of plastic waste from ending up in nature. I think initially the reaction was, "Oh, that's really great." But there wasn't necessarily a complete understanding of why we as a global financial institution would be tackling plastic waste. I think very, early on, the more natural question is, isn't that something more for the chemical companies or the consumer packaging companies? And, the reason that we did it was we had this real conviction that because plastic is so permeated and woven through every single aspect of the economy and, all of our personal lives, we had to have sort of a full economy approach to it. And that meant every sector, including finance, as a major enabler across that. So what's been really interesting is, right when we launched the plastic waste resolution, that was April 2019, I believe, we did a small proof of concept bond with the World Bank. It was a $10 million bond focused on, life below water, to really focus on, marine plastic. And we saw that it was very, very successful. It led us then over the next 2 years to be able to do much larger transactions, like, the $1 billion green bond with Pepsi, focused on reducing the virgin plastic in their beverage chain, with Coca-Cola FEMSA, with Alphabet. And all along that progression, what we've seen is a really increasing focus by investors, specifically on plastic waste and the circular economy, not only as something that they cared about as an issue or as a consumer, but really something that they saw the opportunity to align their investments to. I mean, interestingly, we recently launched a new set of strategies where for minimum investment of as low as $10,000, investors could invest in a portfolio aligned towards plastic waste reduction. That has ended up being one of the fastest growing new product introductions on our wealth management platform. That just shows you how much the two are aligned. In fact, when we did a poll of investors, because through the Morgan Stanley Institute for Sustainable Investing, we're continually polling investors about their interests in sustainable investing. I'd say with respect to this topic, there's two very interesting trends I would highlight. One, we've seen an increasing trend in investors being more and more interested, not just in sustainable investing generally, but in very specific targeted themes. And when we ask them, what themes are you most interested in, the very top three were climate change, plastic waste reduction, and circular economy. And I would just conclude by saying I think that really resonates with a lot of things that Paul are saying, that increasingly I think there's been a real shift of people not just seeing circular economy as something that in many people's minds invokes, that must mean less growth, right? If we're using stuff over and over again and we're producing less stuff, that must be less growth. People are now understanding that can actually be an incredibly compelling growth opportunity and therefore investment opportunity. So we've been very excited to see the progress there.
If I could move you on, Paul, to a slightly different area, the question of stranded assets, obviously a familiar concept when it comes to oil and energy. But in plastics, we're seeing that companies representing more than 20% of the world's plastic packaging industry have committed to increase their use of recycled plastics to 25% of plastic demand by 2025, which then, if they're successful in doing so, will replace a large chunk of the future demand for virgin plastics, which in turn could mean that investment earmarked for the development of new virgin plastic production capacity is at risk. I'm just wondering, Paul, how do you view that concept of stranded assets beyond the energy sector? And is there anything we can learn from the emergence of stranded assets in the past?
Yeah, great question. Well, let me address there's a conceptual question which is very interesting here. I think one of the lessons people are learning in the journey to net zero on climate is about the mathematics of speed, because when it comes to climate change, we have a finite amount of carbon that we can emit into the atmosphere. That's just the way atmospheric chemistry works in order to try to hold warming to certain levels, right? And radiative forcing effects that emissions cause, that the stock of emissions in the atmosphere causes. And so when it comes to climate, as the saying goes, winning slowly is the same as losing. And so when you see targets set in the future for renewable energy or emission reduction cuts, those targets are kind of ladder up to a mathematical equation which helps you understand whether we can or cannot accomplish the overall goal of holding warming to a certain level. In the plastics area, it's interesting that you mentioned that packaging industry would commit to 25% recycled by 2025. I have not done the math on that, but I'd be interested to know, for those who track plastic pollution, right? Can you solve backwards from the end state that you want, which is how fast you are trying to limit plastics pollution in the ocean to avoid certain outcomes, which is the same logic as climate change. And what number do you get if you solve backwards? Is 25% a high number or a low number, right? So that's kind of an interesting conceptual learning across from the benefits of solving backwards from the state of environmental preservation or that you wish to maintain. On stranded assets, that risk is very much real, and there are very interesting issues in particular that cut across the plastics and the climate space, of course. If we're trying to transition away from oil and gas at the same time as reducing virgin plastics production, that is a double challenge for integrated oil and gas and petrochem companies. And to some extent, all of the fervor behind climate action risks driving these companies further into plastics in terms of the way their business models are structured. So I think there's a double whammy effect there that needs to be taken into account. I would say that we are at the beginning stages of reckoning with stranded assets and what to do about them when we recognize, for example, with coal-fired power plants, that it is not enough to stop the construction of new coal plants. We have to accelerate the early retirement of the global fleet of coal plants before the end of their technical or economic lifetimes. And as you say, the same might be true for petrochem facilities. So it could be true in relation to plastics. So there are very interesting financing approaches that are arising in the climate space. I think it's a little easier because you can replace coal-fired power generation with renewable power generation, and that one-to-one swap in the business model for petrochem is a little bit harder to do.
Thanks so much, Paul. And Audrey, turning to you, is the concept of stranded assets, beyond energy, is that something that comes up much in your conversations with clients?
I think it has definitely been growing, right? And I think that what has been really growing as a part of that, or as a part of the larger trend, is this increased awareness by investors. As Paul has said, that we need to focus on the totality of the issue. Right. We can't just sort of, squeeze on the tube somewhere and ignore that it's coming out in a different place. And, I think when you see if you look globally at the sort of regulatory landscape and and policy awareness, when you see more than 75 central banks around the world in the Network for Greening the Financial System focusing on climate as a critical piece of, bank supervisory and in a regulatory regime, that is very significant. And that causes people to really think, very holistically about climate as a material piece of risk. It also then, I think, it's just one brick in kind of the road that says, well, we also need to really think holistically about sustainability issues more broadly. And so not just the energy sector, but really, carbon emissions across all industries. And so I think what we're definitely seeing is, yes, I think the stranded assets conversation has definitely gone from beyond just the energy sector to really thinking more holistically about where will the shifts come. And I think even more broadly, what I've seen more than anything in 2020 in terms of investor mind shifts is people really finally starting to understand how climate and social issues, and plastic waste and circular economy, and social justice are all of a piece, right? That and you really cannot separate thinking about climate change as a pure sort of parts per million perspective. You can't separate that from thinking about the circular economy, about plastic waste, but also about climate justice. And which are the communities that right now are bearing the wildly disproportionate brunt, not only of climate change in terms of extreme weather events, in terms of housing loss, in terms of loss of life, but also then the intersectionality with public health issues, with social justice issues, with disparities in education, in income, in housing, and really that whole connection. I think that, for me, I think that, you asked earlier about the issue of 2020 and the pandemic and how that shifted investor interest. I think one of the biggest things that has changed is people have really understood the interconnectedness of this, and circular economy, I think, is one sort of beautiful metaphor that helps people understand how we really need to bring these conversations together.
I wondered if we could move on now to emerging economies. There's obviously an issue globally with financing circular economy infrastructure, whether it's for reuse or recycling, with plastic packaging being obviously one key example. And in emerging economies, there's often a particular lack of that infrastructure or funding for operational costs for that infrastructure. In some cases, we've seen schemes like extended producer responsibility help to build up that funding, or also blended finance solutions. So I'm just wondering, Audrey, if we take it as a given that private finance also has a role to play, how can people like you help overcome this challenge? What's the role of bankers there?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I think exactly as you sort of suggested in your question, I think one of the important roles that finance can play is helping to really try to provide the liquidity to some of these innovative business models that can be the solutions. I mean, obviously, there are a whole host of policy interventions that can be made at various levels, local, municipal, state, or at the national level. But I think really, why it's so critical to have business, consumers, and finance involved is, as we know, plastic waste, unfortunately, does not respect any sort of national or certainly local municipal boundaries. This is especially critical for emerging economies, especially low-income communities in emerging economies, because first of all, you have the vast amount of plastic waste that is ending up in the ocean is coming from I believe 10 rivers across Africa and Asia, but they are the poor communities, particularly in Africa and Asia, are also disproportionately exposed to plastic waste coming from around the world, from highly developed economies as well as their own local usage. You combine that with the fact that, in many cases, as you noted, in emerging economies, in some of the lowest income, least developed economies, things like, water and, bottled water might be necessary in certain situations. And we want to be able to figure out the ways to preserve the hygiene benefits, the public health benefits of some of those things that have traditionally been afforded by sanitation. But it can't be that those, millions of tons of plastic waste is sustainable for that. So from my perspective, I think that that private finance has an important role to play with both with entrepreneurs, as well as innovators. So innovators thinking about what are the next generation materials that might be able to provide, clean water and, on what we're calling our Sustainable Solutions Collaborative, to think about how can we partner with business models that may not yet be today globally scalable and commercial, but hopefully could be. And specifically looking at actually in emerging economies, how could we really rethink that consumer
just as quickly? Paul, could we turn to you on this one? I mean, I know you've worked across policy and climate finance, so have an interesting perspective here. And what strikes you as important in terms of pushing forward the circular economy in emerging markets?
Yeah. Well, when we talk about a linear economy, which we have built a linear economy, and we are trying to close the loop and make it circular, that is not a uniform task across markets, because as Audrey said, there are different circumstances, different practices, business models, even cultural factors, which mean that the ways that you need to try to close that loop vary by geography. And as you guys have noted, the challenges in emerging markets there are additional challenges in terms of policy regimes that are not in place, perhaps, or basic infrastructure and availability of capital at low cost to fund new solutions. I think if I look at the decarbonization space, one of the most promising models that can also be applied, and actually I think is being applied to circular economy, is the advent of national green investment banks. So these are usually, but not always, publicly owned, commercially operated institutions that are capitalized by a country or sometimes even a city or a region. And they have the ability to blend concessional finance from international institutions with non-concessional finance. And so their ultimate goal is to build national capacity to mobilize local private savings as countries develop, right? And instead of relying forever on a model of official development assistance or development finance, right? They're creating the sort of homegrown financial institutions at the intersection of public and private. And circular economy is a perfect example of the kind of sectoral focus that they can have, because it involves perhaps a greater degree of attention to structuring solutions and dealing with policymakers than commercial banks typically have the appetite to do. And these green investment banks also have an important role in training local commercial banks in how to do certain transactions that they might not be familiar with through a combination of technical assistance and loan guarantees. So I think if I was to look across the spectrum in emerging markets and try to identify a replicable model in the financial sector for financing circular economy, I would point at green investment banks.
Thank you. And are there particular countries that you think could or do serve as a model for others?
Yeah, so there are about 20 emerging markets that are in the process of setting up green investment banks. Some of them have a specific focus on climate, and some of them have a much broader focus on sustainable development. And they actually they're all over the world. It's a relatively little known phenomenon because it's relatively new, but they started in OECD countries. So you have Australia's Clean Energy Finance Corporation or the UK Green Investment Bank. There are a number of green banks in the United States at the state level. But now they have started popping up in Southern Africa. DBSA has set one up. Rwanda, Jordan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and then there are very interesting variations in China. I know the IFC has been very active in cultivating private green banks that perhaps used to be more broadly based commercial banks, and have shifted to focus on green. So there's lots of variation in the business model, but what they share in common is that they are, I would say, in contrast to international financial institutions that come into a market and try to evaluate risk and understand how things work locally, they are based locally, right? So they have an inherent advantage and a shorter feedback loop to effect regulatory change than institutions that are located thousands of miles away and writing letters to governments saying, well, we would invest more in your economy if you only did X and Y. So that's why I think they hold great promise at scale.
The circular economy is proving to be a compelling investment opportunity. However, it isn't one size fits all. There are many different circumstances and contexts that need to be accounted for. Seb, let's turn to the African perspective and how finance can help scale circular economy initiatives to make profit in emerging markets.
Thanks, Rob. Recently, I was able to catch up with Davinah from the African Development Bank, who talked about circular economy as a driver for more inclusive growth on the continent, and as a key part of them reaching net zero emissions.
So, as you know, we are uniquely challenged on the continent as a continent that has the highest number of people under the $2 what do they call it, a measure of poverty. And as such, we have to have instruments that deal at that level. Some of them are instruments, financial instruments for SMEs, because the bulk of poor people are unbankable, as they say. So we create instruments such as trade or green credit lines that are meant to facilitate small and medium-term enterprises. And these we do through intermediaries, which are commercial banks or development banks at a national level. For instance, we have a 300 million credit lines for SMEs in Ghana with the Carl Bank. We have one specific for women called Affirmative Action for Finance of Women in Africa. It's a 300 million facility. So we tailor our financial solutions based on the need.
Yeah, and I guess, in this episode of the Circular Economy show, where risk is a theme, and in many ways, what you're describing there is to me anyway, your role, one of your roles is to de-risk some of the finance on this side. And I think there's a remarkable stat about the number of people who actually have access to credit, for instance, on the African continent, which also brings me on to this topic of the circular economy. What role does the circular economy then play in the work that you do at the African Development Bank?
So circular economy is uniquely relates to the African way of life. There's a whole of recycle, reuse in the communities that are on the continent. It's a tradition. But as a business, that has not come to stream until 2-3 years ago, when African countries created what is called the Africa Circular Economy Alliance. And so much as waste management was a sector to cover, the whole value chain of circular economy was never considered as an economic activity. And so what we do now is to create one advisory to financing to stimulate businesses that are already there. We already have a network called the Africa Circular Economy Network. That is a network of practitioners. And so what we do as the African Development Bank is to support those SMEs either through intermediaries or if they are bigger entities through our commodity finance or other trade facilitations, whether there are guarantees required. So specific on the circular economy, we are creating an Africa Circular Economy Facility with initial financing from the Nordic Development Fund in Finland. Ideally, it is three-pronged. One is to look at policy interventions and regulations to facilitate interventions. And the second one is to create acceleration and incubation hubs for small and startups businesses. The third one is to create partnerships, so to support the alliance to reach more countries and more partners. And so that's how the facility is set up.
And, it sounds like there you're talking about the circular economy not as something that just drives environmental benefits, for instance. I'm sure that it plays into net zero ambitions, but as kind of a driver of growth, of jobs, of economic activity. Is that the case?
That's the case. As you know, Africa is said to have the biggest population growth as we get to 2050, when we are expected to be reaching net zero. It is a continent that is going to be the global market because of its youthful population. And as such, the circular economy, because of its base reach, enables interventions, whether it's in the digital space for the youth with new innovations or through waste that is generated. It is estimated that Africa's e-waste alone has a value of 3.4 billion. And so those are new areas that tap in. So with mineral waste from estimated at 3.4 billion, that means it offsets new minerals coming on stream. And so those are the new areas that we are tapping in to ensure that we don't mine new minerals when there is already minerals in the West. in terms of e-waste that is on the continent.
And I guess like a big theme within the financing space in general, I guess, in continents like Africa is this kind of infrastructure investment that's needed to enable some of these systems to work. Do you also see innovation happening more upstream in terms of empowering some of these entrepreneurs, some of the youth you're talking about, to design things differently from the outset?
Yeah, that is the way the alliance is set up is to try and do technology transfer. Technology transfer is one of those areas that are even listed in the Paris Agreement to enable net zero or even climate resilience. And so skills and technology transfer is one of those means of reaching that goal. And so what we do in the alliance and even in the facility is to create innovation hubs where partners in the hub, for instance, Finland, that has been a front runner on circular economy, is coming up with country roadmaps to design roadmaps and to design incubation facilities for rolling out circular practices. So we have a holistic view on how to mainstream circular economy in Africa's national development plans, even as climate targets.
Also come out of some of the work that, I'm not sure if it came directly from the African Development Bank, but there's a paper or something published recently on sort of 5 big bets on the circular economy in Africa, which looks at these sort of big themes, whether these opportunities. Does your work play into that?
Yeah, so the 5 bets is a work of the Africa Circular Economy Alliance, which the bank hosts. And those are triggers. They are not the only activities or sectors that trigger closing the loop on circularity, but they are the triggers that we see the highest potential of growth. And so one of them is food waste. Because 60% of Africa's population is employed in agriculture. And so that is one area that we have to look in. And then we have, of course, as a growing continent, we have built economies as one of the areas that we have to look in trying to foster circularity. As I mentioned, e-waste is a big challenge. You have, for instance, in Ghana, 150,000 tons of e-waste on the landfills, and then we have fashion and textile as an employer sector, and so all those we see as trigger areas because of their potential for green jobs and industry. As you know, Africa is one of the least industrialized continents, and so these 5 areas could trigger industrialization while creating jobs. And so to us, we see that as a trigger towards reaching goal 1 of the SDGs, which is leave no one behind in poverty reduction.
And I mean, it sounds like what you're talking about there is, and it's, suits the name of the organisation you're working for, a development path for Africa. Like in many ways, the development pathway that some other parts of the world have gone through is just not available anymore due to the various global constraints, and sort of pairing this circular economy opportunity with the opportunity to actually create prosperity in this region that benefits the geography as well seems to be what you're talking about there, which is great.
Dealing with Africa's poverty reduction journey has to ensure that it's inclusive because of the growing population. Unemployment is still a big challenge. It's a big challenge everywhere, but in Africa, it's going to be the most youthful continent. That is one area to tap in terms of ensuring that you have the right skills, the right opportunities to grow. And again, Africa still has 65% of the world's arable land. And so pairing these resources in the resources that are still available on the globe, that makes it possible for to use Africa's resources optimally in addressing poverty.
Rather than just extracting the value that's rich in resources, actually turning that into value that creates inclusive growth for the region. How does COVID play into this? I mean, it's hard to have a conversation right now about any of the topics we've touched on without talking about the pandemic. Has that been a part of this story for African Development Bank and the circular economy in the region as well?
Certainly. I guess the pandemic has been a challenge for everywhere in the world, but specific for countries that are already vulnerable. And in the continent of Africa being, saying one where you have the highest number of people in poverty. COVID has triggered actually the first recession in the last 25 years. And so that has caused distress in an already disturbed socioeconomic situation. And so what, as a bank, we did from the onset when the pandemic hit was to create a post-COVID recovery facility to enable or ease on the financial distress of the countries. We set out a 10 billion COVID recovery facility that our member countries could tap in, and also issued a social bond, a COVID social bond for 3 billion, as some of the stress relievers for COVID. But that is to support Africa's green recovery program. There is last year what was launched by African environment ministers called the Africa Green Stimulus Program. That includes circular economy as the number one of the 12 areas of priority in the recovery, ideally looking into where the highest absorption in terms of recreating jobs. And so that has enabled, and those are kind of the areas that the stimulus packages will go into. Tomorrow at the African Union, there's going to be launching an African Green Recovery Action Plan that includes 5 priority areas in agriculture, in energy, in finance, as well as in nature-based solutions. And so what we are doing from our side is to ensure that we have programs ready. For instance, we have a desert to power energy program. It's a solar belt to cover the entire Sahara Desert. So we are using Africa's natural resources like the solar radiation to enable or to alleviate energy poverty. And so that is a 10 gigawatt program that covers the entire Sahara Desert. And then we have another program on climate adaptation called Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. It's a 25 billion program over 5 years. And so ideally, all that is to ensure that as we push for net zero 2050, Africa is not left behind in terms of resilience. As you know, there is a pledge in the Paris Agreement to raise 100,000 billion per year to support developing countries' sustainable development goals towards climate resilience. And so we hope to tap into those resources as we drive that broad adaptation agenda for the continent.
So in many ways, if over the last 2 or 3 years, this kind of circular economy story has been building up in the African context, and talked about the 5 big bets. You talked about some of the work that's gone into understanding where the opportunities are, and now the pandemic has put on this kind of urgency, acceleration in terms of, well, this is a, creating jobs, better growth, inclusive growth agenda for the region alongside, SDGs, climate, these big global targets that are being set?
I guess the pandemic has, if there is a silver lining to it, has created rethink of business. As I talk to you, I'm working from home, and as such, I'm able to multitask on different levels. But what it has done is to rethink how we do growth and development in terms of looking at small niches of businesses. And I recall when the pandemic happened, a lot of shops started converting plastic buckets into wash basins. And so there was businesses created in the artisanal markets to try and remodify, repurpose tools that were used to deal with the health situation. We had tailors start to do masks. We had small pharmaceuticals do hand wash creams. And so there was a new industry that was generated from the pandemic. And we hope to tap into all that innovation, online platforms that were generated, especially learning from the financial digital platforms that were created and rehearsed because of the stay-at-home practices. And so by investing in infrastructures that accelerate growth that we've seen as the pandemic hit, we hope to reach the biggest growth areas, which is in the youth who are educated and need to be skilled to tap into those resources. So we've seen a growth in youth startups in these areas as they tap into the new opportunities. And circular economy presents those opportunities by nature of optimization.
So in a region where there's so little access to credit and such a tremendous issue of poverty, it was fascinating to hear Davinah there talking about the role that circular economy can play in actually driving better growth at scale across the region. That's all for today's episode of the Circular Economy Show. We've heard how momentum is massively building in the financial sector behind circular economy and climate-based finance. We've talked about some sticky issues around financing infrastructure in emerging markets and the topic of stranded assets. And hopefully we've given you a sense that finance is a really crucial enabler to make the circular economy happen at scale.
If you've enjoyed this video, please do like or share it with your network. And whilst you're at it, why not subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. That way, you'll be notified every time we go live, so you'll never miss a thing. Thank you for joining this episode, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.